1995, Everett Worthington Jr.'s elderly mother was murdered in her home by two young burglars. Something terrible has happened, was how the phone call started. And then the details: the ransacked house, the strewn body, the blood. It almost seemed too surreal to take in. Preparing for the trip from Richmond to Knoxville, Everett was frantic, trying to numb his feelings with the narcotic of action. On the drive down, he and his sister reflected on some of the good times that they had shared with their mother. Everett recalled a few months prior when he was a guest on a radio talk show, and the host of the talk show came on and said, "We have time for one more caller, but this caller is special." Everett recalled the voice that came in. It was the slow, soft East Tennessee drawl of his mother. "Sonny," came the familiar sound of his childhood nickname. "Sonny, I've been listening to you, and I just wanted you to know you're a good boy, Sonny." That was one of many stories that they shared on the drive down, each story too precious to forget, but also, in light of the circumstances, too painful to remember. And all of those stories fit just inside a big, heavy box that had just been delivered and was now sitting square in his life. And that was the dilemma for him. How could he remember what was so precious to him without also accepting all of the painful feelings that came with the news? How could he let go of the rage that came with the delivery of this package that he could not return? When he got down to Knoxville, the investigating officers shared more details of the crime. They said that Everett's mother had been struck by a crowbar, probably burglars who she surprised. Each detail surfaced a new wave of rage within him. After a little bit, an almost inaudible whisper came from him saying, "I'd like to have him alone for just 30 minutes with a baseball bat," he said. He didn't even think that anyone else in the room could hear him until his brother chimed in and said, "It would just take me 10 minutes. And then his sister said, "I'd take 2 hours and make it last longer." Each one of us takes a different amount of time to work through our rage. That night, and for many nights afterwards, the rage continued for Everett, keeping him tossing and turning in his sleep. Questions of revenge came to him, and whether would even that bring any satisfaction. Questions about whether he could ever accept something so horrible. And he felt his rage grow and spread until it contained youth in general and the city of Knoxville and poverty and crime and even the police who were supposed to protect citizens. His rage even spread to himself and the times that he had not been as good a son as he wanted to be, or that he could not be the kind of person who would protect his mother from something like this. More questions came to him as he lay sleepless for many nights. What if they found the killers? Would he ask for the death penalty? Could he listen to their explanation? Would he try to understand them? Could he let go of the resentment, of the anger? Could he face the pain? Could he accept the loss? Could he forgive? Could you? Can we? What is required in forgiveness? A moment of silence. To the chase and tell you how the sermon ends for anybody who has to leave early today. Everett Worthington Jr. met with the two boys who murdered his mother, and he forgave them. He never let go of the memories of love that he had for her. Instead, he just let go of his rage and his distrust. He found peace without having to close his heart. He's no longer kept awake by questions of why or what if or images of that evening. Everett Worthington Jr., despite having to face the unimaginable pain and loss of such a horrible crime, turned out just fine. I can't tell you how Everett Worthington Jr. did it exactly, how he managed to get through that hurt and pain without becoming bitter or resentful. If you'd like to know the details, then you can read the book that he wrote describing the event and the days and the weeks and the months that followed. But this sermon isn't about Everett Worthington Jr. and how he got past his hurts. It's about us and how we get past ours. How did he do it? How did he get through his ordeal? Could simply just be his character. Or it could be the years of training that Dr. Everett Worthington Jr. had as a clinical psychologist. Or perhaps his years of study in reconciliation counseling as a therapist for marriage and families doing reconciliation work. Or it might be one of a dozen articles that he wrote on the subject of forgiveness. Or it could be one of the 6 books that he wrote about forgiveness before even having this ordeal. But I thought if we knew all of this about him, we might conclude that his ability to heal and forgive was beyond our capacity. We might not ourselves feel up to the task. After all, we don't have his training or his experience. It took him only a year to forgive the 2 young boys who murdered his mother, and yet many of us spend every Thanksgiving dinner of our lives exchanging barbs with our siblings about the mean things that Granddad said to Grandma for overcooking the turkey, and they've both been dead for 30 years. It might help to know, though, that Dr. Everett Worthington Jr. struggled mightily with forgiveness in the days that followed that night. He questioned every study about forgiveness. He questioned every anecdote he heard that told him to forgive. He questioned every religion that spoke about forgiveness. He even questioned all the books and everything that he himself had written on the subject. When it came to his own time of testing, nothing was automatic. Nothing was routine. He still had to push through the darkness of his own discomfort. Maybe it was character that brought Dr. Everett Worthington Jr. through his trauma and into peace, because he knew that no one would ever be able to see his internal turmoil as he tossed and turned in his sleep, and that no one would ever know if his thoughts were full of malice, and no one would see what was written on his heart, only what was written on the pages of his books. Perhaps it really just was character that brought him peace. After all, they say character is what is forged when we do what we do when no one else is looking. But Dr. Everett Worthington Jr. is not the only one with character, and he's not the only one with needs to forgive. All of us have been hurt, and all of us had some time or another received delivery of a big, heavy package that we did not want or expect. And we knew as soon as it was delivered what was inside. Our broken heart, dreams that we had that were stepped on, broken agreements or expectations, a tarnished self-image, something that we had spent our whole lives keeping tidy. And we know that sometimes that package comes to us sent from someone who we don't even know, who was just careless, who wasn't even aware that anyone would receive it. More often, though, those kinds of packages come from people who we do know, which makes it even harder. Sometimes it comes even with the obvious intent to hurt, which means that the package that we receive is tied in a bow of betrayal. Everyone who lives long enough receives such a delivery. And when we receive such a delivery, what are we told? Get over it. Find a way to return to a belief that it's all worth it. Maybe even pretend that it didn't even happen, where we can allow ourselves to be vulnerable again, where we can take chances in those same circumstances, in that same world that is precarious and sometimes feeling treacherous, maybe even with those same people who hurt us. And we don't know if we can. There is a poem by poet David White that speaks about character and what kind of character calls us to this hard place. It's called Self-Portrait. It doesn't interest me if there is one God or many gods. I want to know if you belong or feel abandoned. If you know despair and can see it in others. I want to know if you are prepared to live this life with its harsh need to change you. If you can look back with firm eyes in a precarious world saying, this is where I stand. I want to know if you know how to melt into that fierce heat of living, falling toward the center of your own belonging. I want to know if you are willing to live day by day with the consequence of love and the bitter, unwanted passion of your sure defeat. I have been told in that fierce embrace, even the gods speak of God. I suspect, like Everett Worthington Jr., that we've all spent a little time holding that imaginary baseball bat, taking swings at the people who have hurt us, or for whom our anger is directed. In our minds, we thrash around, and just like his siblings, it takes us a different amount of time to work through that rage. But the problem is that when we swing that bat in our mind, there is no one who can get hurt except us. There is an old Saturday Night Live episode with Jack Handey. Anybody remember Jack Handey?
No.
I love Jack Handey.
What season was this?
I don't know. But he describes that same feeling. He says, imagine the person who hurt us. And as we imagine that person, we light a stick of dynamite. And then we call them on the phone, and then we hold the burning fuse up to the receiver and we say, hear that? That's dynamite, baby. Holding on to anger too long is like giving ourselves the gift of an exploding cigar. Or as writer Anne Lamott puts it, holding on to resentment is like drinking rat poison and then waiting for the rat to die.